This is Ira Gorlick, and this lecture is on economic constraints. So what are economic constraints? Economic constraints are those things that are out of the individual's, the organization, or the community's control. High-level, commonly referenced constraints might include prices, laws, norms, the natural and technical environments that the economic activity is taking place in. There are essentially three types of constraints. One is community constraints. They include tax rates, inflation rates, money supply, interest rates, currency exchange rates, unemployment rates, periods of high economic growth, and periods of economic contraction, such as recessions and depressions. Essentially anything that goes on in the marketplace that is affected by the community at large. There are also natural law constraints, things like physics and chemistry, geography, human behavior, biochemistry. So if you're in airline industry, obviously you have things like physics that you have to deal with and geography. If you're in the transportation industry, you have human behavior. How much can somebody drive? I mean, you have these natural laws that affect the economic activity that you're participating in. And finally, you have architectural constraints. These are the physical constraints brought on by the specific architecture chosen. So I list here Apple OS versus Android OS, TCP/IP versus X25, a house made out of wood versus a house made out of steel. The specific architecture that you're building in, that you're working in, is going to have constraints. So if you're working on Apple, you have different constraints than you're working under Android. The reason this is important, and it's important when we talk about economics, is that constraint sets the limits and functionality of the options available to economic actors. Constraints essentially influence the cost and benefits of the different actions, opportunities available to the economic actors. Now this is important, and we're going to talk a lot about this in terms of any number of different ideas. But the economic reality is that all constraints can and do change. Community policy constraints clearly change all the time. In fact, there's a whole concept in economics called rent seeking. I'm going to talk about that later in the lectures, which addresses how individuals try to change the constraint by using others to get the change implemented that benefits them the most. And of course, natural law constraints can change. Take man's natural constraint against flying. This changed the economics of transportation when we were able to change that constraint against flying. A final point on this section is that architectural constraints cannot change. A wood house is a wood house, a steel house is a steel house, Apple OS is Apple OS. But the economic actor can change architectures. And this is important because if the economic actor does not like the constraints of, let's say, Apple OS, they can change to Android or go to Windows OS. Or they can come up with a whole new architecture. Yes, we're going to talk about them changing the constraints within the architecture, but in general, you have to think about it in terms of the architectural constraints not changing, but the economic actor has the ability to change architectures. So this is, to me, a fundamental idea, and Barbara Van Schweck said it very well here. We're going to talk a lot about Barbara Van Schweck. She is a pro-net neutrality advocate, and she has a lot of important things to say. She wrote, "An economic system evolves as economic actors pursue their own interests within a set of constraints, and as they act to change those constraints." So think about that in the broader sense. Economic systems evolve as economic actors pursue their own interests. So this goes back to Adam Smith and free market. People work to pursue their own interests. Adam Smith talked about the baker baking because it's in the baker's best interest to bake, not because the government wants them to bake. That people should be allowed to pursue their own interests. People know their own interests more than anything else, so they're the best ones to pursue that. However, they pursue these interests within a set of constraints. And if those constraints do not fully satisfy the individual, that they can act to change those constraints. And I'm going to talk a lot about this, but I think this is the key sort of underlying driver for what we want to look at when we look at net neutrality. So specifically in terms of net neutrality constraints, the internet has very specific constraints built in, and I've listed 3 here: modularity, layering, and end-to-end arguments. And I'm going to talk about those in the technical section of this class. Remember, this class is 3 or 4 sections. One of the sections is a technical section, and I go into all the technical issues with the internet. And so I will be addressing modularity, layering, and end-to-end arguments within that section. But those are the constraints with which the internet has built into it. And for good or bad, these technical constraints directly impact the economic constraints in terms of what we can do. The people with the internet are constrained because of these technical constraints. This is why we cannot talk about finding the optimum role in the community in managing the internet without a clear understanding of the economic constraints inherent in the telecommunications marketplace. In the next lecture, I'm going to talk about what is optimum. Remember that the learning objective is to determine what is the optimum role of the community in managing commerce in general and the internet in specific. And so we have to define what is optimum, and I'm going to do that in the next lecture.